The first thing Professor Vreth said when Marcus Hale walked through the door was not hello. It was, "You're late, primate." Marcus set his bag down on the nearest open bench. The lecture hall of the Velhari Institute of Xenobiology was tiered like a natural amphitheater, carved from pale stone that hummed faintly with the electromagnetic baseline of the planet Duveros, a low C-sharp buzz that Marcus had learned to ignore over the past 11 months. The other students, 14 Velhari, 2 Grethari exchange scholars, and 1 Moskin whose species Marcus still could not properly name, all turned in unison to look at him. Their eyes were wide, some amused, some pitying. The Moskin's fronds rustled. "I apologize, Professor," Marcus said. He was not particularly sorry. He'd been late because the transit pod had broken down again, and the Velhari maintenance drone had spent 6 minutes explaining the malfunction in a dialect he barely spoke, and then had offered him a cup of fermented herb water by way of apology, and he had accepted, because to refuse would have been rude, and Marcus Hale was, above almost all things, not rude. Professor Vreth was Velhari, like most of the Institute's faculty. The Velhari were tall, lean, and very slightly luminescent in the ultraviolet range, which Marcus could not see but which his biosensor band had once helpfully translated as faint blue-white around the shoulder ridges. They were herbivores, strict ones, with 3-chambered digestive systems optimized for processing cellulose, a resting heart rate of 44 beats per minute, and a cultural tradition of calm that predated their spaceflight era by 2,000 years. They were also, in Marcus's experience, prone to a specific and very elegant form of condescension that they had spent centuries refining into something close to art. Professor Vreth gestured toward the bench. "Sit." Marcus sat. "As I was explaining before our human arrived," the professor said, pivoting back to the transparent display board, "the dietary stratification of sentient species is not merely biological. It is a reflection of evolutionary trajectory. Plant consumption requires patience, complexity, the ability to extract sustenance from sources that do not flee, that do not resist, that do not require violence to obtain. Species that evolved around hunting, around the crude pursuit of prey, carry that impulsivity in their neurological architecture. They are reactive, short-sighted, prone to aggression." He did not look at Marcus. He didn't need to. The Grethari scholars took meticulous notes. The Moskin's fronds rustled again. Marcus opened his notebook and wrote down the lecture title, Dietary Basis of Civilizational Development, Session 9. He underlined it twice. Then he wrote, in smaller letters below, "Ask him about the Hrathi." He did not raise his hand, not yet. He had learned, over the course of his 11 months at the Velhari Institute, that timing mattered more than instinct. This was itself a lesson in the thing Vreth was describing, the planning horizon, the patience required to extract value from a situation that didn't immediately yield it. His grandfather had taught him something similar, though in very different language. Don't pull the meat from the heat too early just because you're hungry. Impatience ruins more dinners than poor ingredients. So Marcus waited. He watched the lecture unfold. He observed the architecture of the argument as Vreth built it, the careful laying of evidentiary foundation, the cross-species comparisons drawn from the Institute's vast xenobiological archive, the smoothly assembled consensus of 3,000 years of interstellar observation. The Velhari were thorough. They were, genuinely, brilliant. Their science was meticulous and peer-reviewed, and built on a foundation of data that made most human scientific institutions look like enthusiastic amateurs. Marcus felt this not as diminishment but as honest fact. They had been doing this longer. They knew more. The civilizational framework they operated within had been tested and refined across centuries of interstellar contact. What they were not, what Professor Vreth, for all his brilliance, was not, was immune to the particular intellectual blind spot that came with being at the center of your own reference frame. The Velhari Institute occupied a central position in the Galactic Academic Council's rated institutions, fourth overall by the last consortium ranking. It was, culturally, an institution that was accustomed to being looked at rather than looking outward. The scholars who came here came to learn from the Velhari, not to challenge them. This was reasonable. This was, in most cases, the appropriate disposition. But it had created, over time, a particular flavor of confidence that occasionally crossed into something else. Marcus wrote in his notebook, "The Hrathi aren't outliers just because they inconvenience the framework. That's not science. That's aesthetics." Then he underlined it twice and waited. The session continued for another hour. Professor Vreth covered the caloric efficiency of herbivorous diets, the sociological evidence linking meat consumption to higher rates of interclan violence in early civilizational stages, the neurological studies suggesting that obligate carnivores had statistically shorter planning horizons than herbivores, citing the Voron decline of the Third Era as his primary case study. He had a gift for the lecture. His voice was measured, his evidence organized, his slides elegant. He was also, Marcus had decided over the past 3 months, systematically building a framework whose conclusion was obvious. Herbivores were on the whole more evolved, more civilized, more worthy of the stars. He never said it directly. He was too practiced for that. When the session ended and the other students filed out, Marcus stayed behind. He did this every week. Professor Vreth had, at the beginning of the semester, mistaken this for enthusiasm. He had since revised that interpretation. "You have a question," the professor said. "Not a question, an acknowledgement of inevitability." "A few." Marcus pulled out his notebook. "You cited the Voron decline as evidence that early meat consumption leads to systemic societal collapse. But the primary literature on the Voron decline, specifically the work published by the Duveros Institute of Historical Studies, not the secondary sources you used, suggests the collapse was driven primarily by resource mismanagement in the secondary agricultural cycle, not dietary factors." Vreth set down his marking stylus. "The dietary factors created the resource mismanagement." That's one interpretation. The Hrathi are obligate carnivores with the longest continuous civilization in the catalogued galaxy, 41,000 years of unbroken cultural development. You mentioned them in passing during Session 3 and haven't cited them since. The Hrathi are an outlier. 19 species in the catalogued galaxy consume animal protein as a primary or secondary dietary component. 7 of them have reached Type II civilizational classification or above. That's 37%, which is slightly above the baseline rate for all species regardless of diet. At some point, an outlier becomes a counterexample. The professor looked at him with the particular expression Marcus had come to think of as the taxonomic gaze. The look a scientist gives a specimen that is behaving in a way the scientist finds annoying but technically cannot fault. "Your people," Vreth said carefully, "are very young. Humans have been spacefaring for, 112 years. The framework I'm presenting reflects patterns across thousands of years of cross-species data. One should perhaps maintain some humility when engaging with evidence one's civilization is too new to have generated." "That's fair," Marcus said. "I do maintain humility about it. I just don't think humility requires ignoring the Hrathi." He picked up his bag and left. In the corridor, he passed Ithar, one of the Gret-Hari exchange scholars, who had been waiting with the particular stillness of someone who had decided not to pretend they weren't listening. "The Hrathi argument is a good one," Ithar said quietly. "He won't acknowledge it publicly, but it's a good one." "I know," Marcus said. "You've made it before." "Twice." He gives the same response both times. At some point repetition is either stubbornness or hope, and I haven't decided which one it is yet. Ithar walked with him a few steps. The corridor was high-ceilinged and very slightly curved, built to move air in a passive circulation system that made the whole building breathe in a slow rhythm. Marcus had spent 2 weeks adjusting to the sensation that the walls were alive before his nervous system accepted it as background. In Gret-Hari academic tradition, Ithar said, a professor who dismisses an argument 3 times without logically refuting it is considered to have conceded the point by implication. That's a very elegant tradition. It's also rarely honored in practice. Ithar's crest rippled. But the principle stands. You have presented a valid argument supported by primary literature. He has responded with appeals to humility rather than counter-evidence. In strict epistemic terms, he is losing. Epistemically losing, Marcus said, and institutionally winning. He has the podium. For now, Ithar said, and turned down a side corridor. Marcus walked on toward the courtyard. He ate lunch in the Institute's common courtyard, sitting on a bench near the central water feature, which was a spiral of polished stone that channeled the planet's natural mineral springs into a series of shallow pools. It was beautiful. He'd thought so since his first week. From his bag, he took a sealed container. Inside, 4 strips of cured pork belly, a small jar of roasted tomato sauce, and 3 meatballs made from a blend of lamb and beef that he'd spent an hour and a half preparing the previous evening in his apartment kitchen. The apartment had a functional stove, which the previous human tenant, a linguist named Priya, who had left Duveros 6 months before Marcus arrived, had apparently campaigned for aggressively. Marcus owed Priya a debt he could never repay. He ate slowly, looking at the water feature. The bacon was good. He'd oversalted the sauce slightly, which he considered acceptable. Selene came and sat beside him about 10 minutes in. She was Velhari, one of his cohort, and she was in the unusual position of being both a student in Professor Vreth's class and a genuine friend of Marcus's. A combination that required her to perform a specific kind of diplomatic agility that Marcus respected enormously. "Vreth is upset," she said. "I know. He says you're being combative." "I'm disagreeing with him using primary sources." Marcus offered her the container. "Do you want a meatball?" Selene examined the container with the careful interest she brought to most unfamiliar things. She was not, Marcus had learned, repulsed by meat. The Velhari reaction to animal protein ranged from dietary avoidance to cultural discomfort to active disgust, and Selene fell into the first category. She simply didn't eat it, as a matter of preference and physiology, but she didn't perform horror about other people who did. "No thank you," she said. "What is it made from?" "Lamb and beef, earth animals, both are ruminants." "What does it taste like?" "Meat," Marcus said, and then, because that wasn't useful, rich, fatty, a little smoky from the spice blend. The texture is soft in the middle and slightly crisp on the outside from searing. "You cook these yourself?" "The meatballs, yes. The bacon I cured last week. It takes about 4 days." Selene looked at him with the expression he recognized as intellectual recalibration. She was updating a model. "You spend 4 days making food." "The curing is mostly passive. I check it twice a day." He ate another meatball. "It's also about the process. Curing bacon is a skill. My grandfather taught me. His grandfather taught him. It's I don't know, it connects you to something." Vreth would say that's impulsive, resource-intensive behavior, with a low caloric efficiency ratio. Vreth has never had bacon. Selene was quiet for a moment. The water feature made its low musical sound. "You know he's not entirely wrong," she said, "about some of it. The correlations he cites are real." "I know. But you don't think they mean what he says they mean." "I think they mean something more complicated." Marcus wiped his hands on a cloth and resealed the container. "My species evolved hunting prey that was faster than us, smarter than us in its own ways, and highly motivated to not be caught. To catch it anyway, we developed language, planning, cooperation, delayed gratification. We ran prey down over 2 days sometimes, taking turns, sleeping in shifts, following tracks across terrain we'd memorized in advance. All of that impulsive, short-sighted behavior you'd expect from apex predators, and yet you're here. And yet we're here. At a table, a bench, with a Velhari who is choosing to understand us, next to a water feature made from stone that was carved by someone who will never know we're sitting here, on a planet we traveled 100 light-years to reach. He looked at the water. I don't think the mechanism of violence or patience is the variable. I think the variable is whether a species can learn to extend its circle of concern beyond its immediate kin. Herbivores developed that through long social groups and stable food sources. Carnivores that survived long enough developed it through the cooperation required to hunt at all. Different paths, same necessary destination. Selene considered this for a long time. You should say that in class. Vreth would tell me to maintain humility about evidence. My civilization is too young to have generated. He does say that. It's not wrong, we are young. He also, Selene said, respects anyone who gives him a genuine argument. He just doesn't show it while the argument is happening. That night Marcus went home and cooked. This was not unusual. He cooked most nights, not extravagantly, not always with the focused ambition of the meatball sessions, but consistently. Cooking was the organizing structure of his evenings, the way research was the organizing structure of his days. A practice with a beginning, a middle, and a legible end, in a life that otherwise tended toward the formless expansion of open-ended inquiry. His apartment was small by Earth standards and enormous by Duvero's standards, where space was expensive, and the Velhari preference for communal living meant that single-occupancy housing was considered slightly eccentric. It had a balcony that looked out over the mineral plateau, a bedroom barely larger than the bed, a study that was mostly desk and shelves, and a kitchen that Priya the linguist had fought to have equipped with a proper heat element, and which Marcus had since supplemented with a cast-iron pan smuggled in his second suitcase, a knife roll, and the hand grinder that had prompted 20 minutes of custom scrutiny. He made pasta that night, one of the things he discovered he could approximate on Duvero's with local grain equivalents, and some creative interpretation of the rolling technique. The sauce was a simple one. Garlic, olive oil. He traded a colleague 2 months of coffee for dried herbs from the human quarter's very small imported goods shelf. He ate standing at the kitchen counter, looking at his notebook. The argument about the Hrothi bothered him in the way that bad citations always bothered him, not emotionally, but structurally. It sat in the framework of Vreth's work like a load-bearing wall that had been quietly removed and replaced with assumption, and the assumption held mostly, because no one was walking into that room and jumping up and down to test the floor. He was, he acknowledged, perhaps unusually motivated to jump on the floor, partly by professional conscience, partly because the framework, unchallenged, did not merely describe humanity as impulsive and short-sighted. It made that impulsiveness the species' defining feature, the thing that would limit them, the ceiling on their trajectory. And he was sitting on a planet 100 light-years from Earth, in a kitchen that a linguist had argued for, eating pasta he'd made from alien grain using a technique his grandmother had taught him, as part of an 11-month effort to contribute something useful to a galaxy that had been getting along without his species for a very long time. He was not going to leave without saying clearly, "We're more complicated than that. We've always been more complicated than that." He washed the pan and went to bed. The following week, Marcus arrived 3 minutes early to class. He also arrived with food. This was not technically against any institute rule. The common areas allowed eating. The lecture hall did not have an explicit prohibition on it. Marcus had checked. The Velhari legal framework around academic spaces was written entirely around the assumption that no one would want to eat during a lecture, because eating during a lecture was not something a Velhari would typically do. It interrupted the meditative quality of learning, created sensory noise, and was considered faintly disrespectful to the material being studied. He set his container on the bench in front of him. He was not trying to be provocative. He had brought the food because he'd been running late on his morning work and hadn't eaten, and because the class ran 2 hours and he would be hungry, and because he saw no logical reason why he should go hungry in order to not confuse a cultural framework that was not his own. Professor Vreth arrived, looked at the container, and looked at Marcus with the taxonomic gaze. "What," he said, "is that?" "Lunch," Marcus said. "I apologize for eating during your lecture. I'll be discreet." "What is in it?" "Bacon meatballs." The word meatballs landed in the lecture hall like a dropped piece of lab equipment. Not a crash, a clatter. The kind of sound that makes everyone turn and look even before they understand why. The Grethari scholars looked up from their notes. The Moskin's fronds fully extended. 3 of the Velhari students nearest to Marcus shifted slightly, involuntarily, in a way that was not quite recoiling but was adjacent to it. Vreth stared at the container for a moment. His shoulder ridges, Marcus knew, would be showing that blue-white UV glow right now. The biosensor band confirmed it a second later, elevated. "You brought animal flesh into my classroom." "I brought lunch into your classroom. The animal flesh is part of the lunch." Marcus kept his voice level. "I won't eat it until the break if that's preferable. I can also move to a seat near the back." He noticed peripherally that the student nearest to him, Velhari, 3rd row, whose name was Thesson and who had never spoken to Marcus directly, had shifted her stool by exactly 4 centimeters away from his bench. He noticed this the way he noticed most things in this lecture hall, carefully, without reaction, filing it away as information rather than insult. She was not being hostile. She was responding to a stimulus that her entire cultural and biological framework had trained her to find unusual. He was sitting here with his container of lunch, a kind of sensory event that this room had not been designed for. He had not intended to be a sensory event. He had intended to eat lunch. Vreth, for his part, was doing something Marcus had not seen him do before. He was genuinely uncertain. The expression was subtle. The Velhari were not an expressive species in the human sense. Their emotional register distributed across the UV shoulder glow and a set of micro-adjustments in posture that Marcus had spent months learning to read. But it was there. The professor had a response prepared for students who were late. He had a response prepared for students who challenged his citations. He had a response prepared for students who were, in the broad cultural sense, of a species he found intellectually interesting but civilizationally limited. What he did not appear to have a response prepared for was a student who had brought a container of food to class because he was hungry and saw no particular reason why that should require apology. "That is," Vreth stopped. He was too practiced to say what he was about to say. He set down his materials and looked at Marcus with something that was, for the first time in 11 months of classes, not the taxonomic gaze. It was something older, less organized. "That is a significant cultural statement." "It's not intended as one," Marcus said honestly. "I was hungry." "You were hungry," the professor repeated. His tone was very careful. "I was up early running calibrations on the mineral sample analysis, and I missed breakfast. I have a long afternoon after this class." "I brought food." Marcus looked down at the container. "I can leave if you'd prefer. I understand if having it in the room is genuinely distressing." Vreth was quiet for what felt like a very long time. He was a scientist. Genuinely, Marcus had always believed that underneath the condescension, whatever he was weighing right now, it was not a simple thing. "Stay," the professor said finally, "but eat during the break." "Of course," Marcus said. At the break, 20 minutes midway through, Marcus opened his container. He ate slowly, as he always did when he was being watched. Not performing. Just not rushing. The meatballs were good, the tomato sauce had improved with a night in the refrigerator, the bacon had developed a slight smokiness he was pleased with. Around him, students got up to use the corridor, fetch water, check their messages. Most of them left the immediate area. One of the Grethari scholars stayed, the younger one, who had introduced himself in the first week as Ithar, and sat down at the bench across from Marcus with the expression Marcus, associated with genuine curiosity held very carefully in check. "May I ask what it tastes like?" Ithar said. "Rich," Marcus said, "fatty and savory. The bacon specifically has a smoky, slightly salty depth that takes a while to develop in the curing process. You make it yourself." "Some of it, the animal protein I source from the human quarter of the Port District. There's a butcher there." He paused. "Are the Grethari omnivores?" Ithar's crest rippled, the equivalent of a head tilt. "We eat insect protein, largely as a supplement, not mammalian tissue." "Different tradition." "Very different, and yet," Ithar paused, choosing his words carefully, "I have read some of your arguments in seminar, about the Hratha, about dietary correlation versus causation. I find them compelling." "Vreth doesn't." "Vreth finds most things compelling when he's had time to sit with them. He simply doesn't announce it." Ithar glanced toward the corridor where the professor had disappeared. "He has, incidentally, assigned 3 papers on the Hratha to his advanced seminar this week. I checked the roster." Marcus looked at him. "He didn't mention that in class." "No," Ithar said. "He wouldn't." 3 weeks after the meatball incident, which was how it had come to be referred to, in the quiet, slightly amused shorthand that develops in any academic cohort around a memorable moment, Professor Vreth restructured the final 2 sessions of the semester. He did not announce that he was restructuring them. He simply, when the class assembled, put up a new set of slides. Session 13, Counterarguments and Complexity in Dietary Civilizational Theory. Session 14, Case Studies in Outlier Analysis. The Hrath appeared on slide 3. So did 7 other species Marcus had cited in various arguments over the course of the semester. Vreth lectured with the same measured precision he always had. His slides were as elegant as ever. His citations were impeccable. What was different was the architecture of the argument. It was no longer a tower built to a single, inevitable conclusion. It was a structure with windows in it, multiple angles of light. He covered the Hratha civilization without calling them an outlier. He covered the statistical distribution of type II civilizations by dietary classification, and noted that the correlation between herbivory and long-term stability was real but not deterministic. He presented 2 models, the traditional one, which he had been teaching for 6 years, and a newer integrative model that accounted for cooperation-based development pathways across both dietary strategies. He did not credit Marcus by name. Marcus did not expect him to. At the end of the second session, Vreth dismissed the class and then, as he was erasing the display board, said without turning around, "Mr. Hale." Marcus stopped packing his bag. "The mineral sample analysis you've been running. The sediment cores from the Eastern Canyon deposit." "Yes." "The preliminary findings you shared with the department last month suggested polyorganic layering inconsistent with current geological models for this region." Marcus waited. "That is," the professor said, still facing the display board, "an interesting result." "I thought so. You will present it formally in the advanced seminar before you return to Earth. It is on the calendar." "I saw." The Moskin scholar, Thresovic, has been working on related sediment analysis in a different regional context. I have suggested to the seminar coordinator that your presentations be scheduled on the same day to allow for comparison. Marcus put his bag over his shoulder. "That sounds useful." "It will require you to prepare a full literature review," Vreth said. including the secondary material on dietary adaptation in early mineral processing organisms. There is some overlap between the geological question and the civilizational one. I'll start this week. The professor finally turned from the display board. The taxonomic gaze was gone. What replaced it was something that Marcus had learned in 6 years of academic life, and then 11 months on Duveros, to recognize as the look a scientist gives to a problem they have decided is actually interesting. You have, Professor Vreth said slowly, a peculiarly persistent way of being in a room. I've been told that. It is not, the professor said, with the careful precision of someone navigating unfamiliar terrain, entirely without value. That's very kind. It is not kindness, it is assessment. He picked up his materials. The meatballs, do you make them fresh each time? Of all the questions Marcus had expected, this was not among them. Yes, he said. The preparation takes about 40 minutes. The sauce needs longer, usually 2 to 3 hours for the tomato reduction. 40 minutes. More if I'm grinding the meat myself. I have a manual grinder back at the apartment. Vreth processed this with the expression he usually reserved for anomalous data. And this is satisfying, the process itself. Very much. It's tactile. There's a sequence to it. You're building something that didn't exist before from components that require separate preparation, and the result is either good or it isn't, and you know immediately when you taste it. Like an experiment, Vreth said. Exactly like an experiment. The professor stood for a moment. My colleague in the nutrient chemistry division, he said then, has been studying the molecular structure of Terran origin proteins. She would find your process description useful as contextual information. I'd be happy to talk with her. She would also, theoretically, appreciate a primary source sample for comparison with her synthesized models. He said this with the careful neutrality of someone making a scientific suggestion that happened to have nothing whatsoever to do with personal curiosity. If that were something you were prepared to provide. Marcus looked at him for a moment. The water feature outside made its low musical sound, just audible through the hall's open window. Somewhere in the corridor, the Moskin was talking to one of the Grethari scholars, their voices a weave of sounds that Marcus couldn't fully parse and didn't need to. I'll bring enough for the whole lab, Marcus said. Give me a day's notice so I can do it properly. Vreth's shoulder ridges, the biosensor band noted a moment later, had shifted to the low, warm end of the UV spectrum, a reading Marcus had never seen from him before. He looked it up that night, in the xenobiology index he kept on his tablet. It meant, as best the index could translate it, something adjacent to, at ease. Marcus prepared the meatballs on a Friday evening, which was also the evening he filed his preliminary paper on the polyorganic sediment layers. He worked the two tasks in parallel, the paper at his desk, the meatballs on the counter, moving between them the way he'd always worked best, not in long single-focus blocks, but in a rhythm of alternating attention, each task a break from the other. He made 3 batches, the first for the nutrient chemistry lab, the second for Celine, who had, over the course of the semester, asked 3 times about the taste, and finally admitted she wanted to understand what she was declining to eat. He'd told her she didn't have to eat it. She'd said she knew that. He'd made her a very small portion of the sauce on its own, without the meat, and she had tasted it carefully and said it was extremely intense and also interesting. He told her the full dish was more intense. She'd said she understood. She'd asked for a small meatball and eaten half of it and sat in thoughtful silence for a moment and said, "It tastes like a much more committed version of the sauce." He'd counted that as a success. The third batch was for himself. He ate it at his desk while finishing the paper, looking out the window at the Duveros evening, the twin moons rising over the mineral plateau to the east, the lights of the Institute quad still on, someone's lab still running at this hour. 11 months ago, he had arrived on Duveros with a research grant, 3 suitcases, a manual meat grinder, and a box of spices that the customs officer had examined for 40 minutes, with the focused attention of someone encountering an artifact of an unknown civilization. He had been 29 years old, recently finished with his graduate work on cross-species geological dating methods, and completely unprepared for how alien would actually feel, not the intellectual fact of it, which he'd been prepared for, but the texture of it. The way a room full of beings who were not human would look at you. The way your own body felt like a statement you were making about your species, every time you walked into a new space. He had not prepared to be a representative of humanity. He had prepared to be a geologist. And he was a geologist. He was also, whether he'd intended it or not, something else, evidence. Not of human superiority, or human impulsivity, or human capacity for violence, or any of the other things species with longer civilizational memories tended to conclude about a species that had only recently arrived at the stars. Just evidence that humans were something. A something that was, in the end, not so different from the somethingness of every other species that had crawled out of its gravity well and looked up. Omnivores who had learned to cook, hunters who had learned to farm, fighters who had learned, slowly and with enormous difficulty and an embarrassing number of setbacks, to also be scientists, artists, diplomats, linguists, and geological researchers who brought hand-ground meatballs to alien labs and tried to be patient about the taxonomic gaze. It was, Marcus thought, not a bad summary of the project. The nutrient chemistry lab presentation happened on the following Thursday. Dr. Aviath, Vreth's colleague, small even by Velhari standards, with silver ridge markings that indicated a ripe scientific age of roughly 300 Duveros years, had arranged her lab bench with instruments for molecular spectroscopy and a recording device that Marcus hoped was standard academic documentation practice and not something more unusual. He had brought the meatballs in a sealed transit container with a heat element. They arrived warm. Dr. Aviath examined the container with the focused intensity of someone who had been thinking about this moment. You prepared the binding component, the egg protein, separately and incorporated it before cooking. Yes. I used a 2-to-1 ratio of beef to lamb in the base, with breadcrumbs from a human grain process through the Port District supplier, 1 egg, and a spice blend. He listed the spices. Aviath took careful notes. And the fat content? Not measured precisely. I'd estimate somewhere in the 25 to 30% range for the mixed meat blend. The fat is important to the texture. It melts during cooking and creates the moisture retention that gives the interior its consistency. The exterior sear. 15 seconds each face in a hot pan, then finished in the oven. He paused. Would you like me to taste one first to confirm they're as intended? Please. He ate a meatball. It was good. Perhaps slightly underspiced. He'd adjusted the blend to be less assertive, guessing that the lab team might find his usual levels overwhelming, and he'd been right to do so but had perhaps overcorrected. Dr. Aviath watched him eat with an attention so complete and scientific that it was almost meditative. When he finished, she said, "What are you experiencing?" He thought about it seriously because she was asking seriously. The texture is good, the interior is tender, the exterior has some resistance. The fat has distributed well. The beef and lamb are balanced. Neither is dominant. The spice blend is slightly lighter than I usually make it, which I think was the right call for this context. But there's a slight absence in the back of the palate where I'd usually have more black pepper. You can identify that absence. Once you know what should be there. He paused. It's a sensory vocabulary. You build it over years of eating and cooking and making mistakes and adjusting. My grandfather could identify by smell alone whether a piece of meat had been aged correctly. He'd worked out the Maillard reaction intuitively before he ever knew its name. He just knew that you needed high, dry heat to get the crust, and the crust was what separated acceptable from good. Aviath's recording light was steady. She was noting all of this. The knowledge is transmitted orally, by direct practice. Some of it is written recipes, technique books, culinary traditions going back centuries. But the transmission that actually sticks is the practical one. My grandfather standing beside me at the counter, telling me to feel when the meat is ready to work, not just look at it. You learn the temperature of properly ground meat with your hands. Cold means it's holding together right. Warm means the fat is starting to break and you've overworked it. He looked at the container. It's embodied knowledge. The kind that doesn't transfer through text very efficiently. Aviath looked at her colleagues. Two of them had shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward the container. The third, Peleth, was looking at the meatball on his sample tray with the expression of someone who has run out of reasons not to do the thing they're considering. And your grandfather, Aviath said, learned from his grandfather. Yes, and his grandmother. My family are from the south of a country called Italy, which has a particularly developed culinary tradition. Several thousand years of documented cooking practice, regional variations, specific techniques for specific regional ingredients. The meatball has variants in basically every Italian regional cuisine. My family's version is from the south. It uses lamb because the terrain historically supported sheep farming more than cattle. The terrain informed the food. The food informed the culture. The culture informed the terrain management. It goes in both directions. He was warming to this, the way he always did when a conversation turned to systems and feedbacks. There's a specific breed of sheep that exists because of the culinary preference for a certain flavor profile, and the culinary preference developed because of the sheep that were locally available, and the breed's survival is now dependent on the continued culinary tradition that created the demand for it. Food, culture, landscape, economy, one loop. And that's a small example. Scale it up to the global history of human agriculture, and the entanglement becomes enormous, Aviath said quietly. Enormous, he agreed, which is part of why the framework Professor Vreth teaches always felt incomplete to me. The dietary strategy doesn't just shape the neurology, it shapes the landscape. The landscape shapes the culture shapes the science. Trying to isolate diet as a single variable and trace it cleanly to civilizational outcome ignores all the feedback loops that connect them. Aviath was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very carefully, "I would like to taste one." From behind her, 3 other lab members who had been visibly not looking at the food container simultaneously became very still. Marcus opened the container. Of course. The tasting took longer than he expected, because each of the 5 people who eventually tried a meatball, including the 3 who had been visibly not looking, needed to approach it in their own way. And the ways were varied, from Aviath's immediate direct engagement to one young researcher who held the meatball for several minutes first, examining it with instruments before finally, somewhat defiantly, taking a small bite. His name, Marcus learned later, was Peleth, and he was 22 years old by Velhari reckoning, and he was working on his doctorate in molecular nutrition science, specifically on the protein folding behavior of cross-species amino acid chains under controlled thermal stress. He had been in Professor Vreth's advanced seminar the year before Marcus arrived. He had written his second-year thesis on the dietary basis of neurological architecture in the 18 most recent species admitted to the Galactic Academic Council. He had cited Vreth's framework 14 times. He stood at his lab bench after tasting the meatball with the expression Marcus recognized, not disgust, not enthusiasm, but something more interesting, genuine encounter with a thing that was not what you expected. "It doesn't taste like violence," Peleth said. Marcus looked at him. "No," he said, "it tastes like dinner." "The professor says," Peleth stopped, started again. The theoretical framework suggests that the preparation of animal protein is a practice rooted in aggression, that the act of processing flesh carries a psychological dimension that shapes the consumer. The preparation, Marcus said slowly, is one of the most meditative things I do. My grandfather taught me to grind the meat by hand because the texture is better when you control the coarseness, and because the act of it, the repetition, the rhythm, is calming. Cooking in general is calming. You're turning raw materials into something nourishing and good. The care required is the opposite of aggression. But the animal died, Marcus said simply. Yes, that's true. I don't argue with it. I think about it sometimes. My species has had a very long argument with itself about it, and the argument isn't settled and probably won't be for a while. He paused. What I'd push back on is the idea that the fact of the death makes everything after it violent. The care I take in preparation, the technique, the patience, the knowledge passed down from my grandfather, that's not violence. It's the opposite. It's the attempt to honor a thing by doing it as well as it can be done. Peleth was quiet. He looked at the half meatball still on his sample tray. What happens, he asked after a moment, when you do it badly? You throw it out and start again. Every time. Every time. You can't eat bad food to punish yourself for making it. You just do it again, better. Peleth was quiet again, but a different quality of quiet, the kind that is processing rather than withholding. He picked up the sample tray and looked at the remaining half meatball with the focused attention he probably brought to his protein folding assays. The outer layer, he said, the sear, is that the Maillard reaction you mentioned? Yes, the browning of proteins and sugars at high heat. It creates hundreds of new flavor compounds that don't exist in the raw meat or in slowly cooked meat. The specific compounds depend on the heat level, the duration, the composition of the meat, the presence or absence of added sugars or acids. Marcus watched him. If you want to run a spectroscopic analysis on the two surfaces separately, you'd see a very different compound distribution. Peleth looked up. You know about spectroscopic analysis? I'm a geologist. I run elemental assays on sediment cores. The instrumentation is different, but the logic is the same. He gestured at the bench equipment. May I? He spent the next 40 minutes at Peleth's lab bench, which he had not planned and which made him late for his afternoon seminar, running a comparative molecular analysis of the meatball's interior and exterior surfaces. Peleth ran the instruments. Marcus provided the contextual interpretation. Dr. Aviath observed from across the lab with the expression of someone watching two separate lines of inquiry converge unexpectedly. The compound distribution was genuinely interesting. The seared surface contained pyrazines and furanthiols that Marcus recognized from coffee chemistry papers he'd read years before. The same compounds that gave roasted coffee its depth were present, in different ratios, in the crust of a well-seared meatball. He mentioned this to Peleth, who looked at him with the expression of a young scientist encountering a connection they had not anticipated. You study coffee chemistry, Peleth said. I drank a lot of coffee trying to stay awake during my qualifying exams and fell into a research spiral about where the flavor came from. He paused. I have one of those brains that follows lateral connections. It's occasionally useful. Professor Vreth would say that's characteristic of your species. Professor Vreth would be right. He's right about a lot of things. Marcus looked at the spectroscopic readout on the display. He's also wrong about some things. Both can be true simultaneously, usually are. Peleth looked at the readout, then at Marcus, then at the container that still held 3 remaining meatballs. He had the expression of someone making a decision they hadn't expected to have to make today. Could I take one, he asked, for extended analysis, not to eat? You can take one, Marcus said, and you can eat it if you want or not. It's entirely up to you. Peleth took one. He did not immediately eat it. He put it in a sample container, labeled it with the date and M. Hale/Terran protein preparation 1 bovine ovine blend seared, and set it carefully in the sample archive. That afternoon, according to Selene, who had heard it from a lab adjacent to the archive, Peleth ate it at 4 o'clock. Whether he'd run the analysis first, she wasn't sure. After the final session, Marcus sat in the courtyard for a long time. The water feature made its low musical sound. The twin moons of Duveros were visible in the late afternoon sky, pale discs against the amber haze. 3 other students sat nearby, Velhari, 2 of them, and Thresovic the Moskin, whose fronds were settled in the configuration Marcus had come to associate with contentment. The Moskin communicated complex emotional states entirely through their fronds, and Marcus had spent 4 months mapping the vocabulary, quietly, in a corner of his research notebook labeled observational. THRESSIVIK. He hadn't told Thresovic about the notebook. It felt like the kind of thing that might require explanation. He was thinking about rings. Not physical rings, though the thought had arrived through a strange associative path, through a piece of music he'd been listening to on his headphones that morning, a Hungarian film score he'd downloaded years ago and never listened to that had turned up in a shuffle. The film it came from was something his college roommate had shown him once, an amateur production, low budget and earnest, about 3 people with magical rings who could move through time, and a threat from a dark future that had traveled backward to destroy the present. He'd been barely paying attention when he watched it. He'd been thinking about something else entirely, some paper he was stuck on, some argument he couldn't resolve. His roommate had talked about it afterward. The idea that the rings had been created for a reason, that the people who carried them had been chosen for something greater than they understood, and the threat was real, and the time was running out, and the only thing standing between the present and the dark future was 3 ordinary people who had been given an extraordinary purpose they hadn't asked for. Marcus looked at the institute, the long pale stone buildings, the carved water feature, the electromagnetic hum, which after 11 months his nervous system had fully accepted as background. He was not a time traveler, he did not have a ring. The dark future he was concerned about was not wraiths from 2022 but something slower and more diffuse, a future in which the most powerful civilizations in the catalogued galaxy had decided, on the basis of incomplete evidence and an elegant but flawed framework, that humanity was permanently classified as one thing: reactive, short-sighted, young, limited. The planet-eaters, the impulsive ones, the species that had barely made it off their gravity well before the real civilizations found them and measured them and found them, broadly speaking, instructive but not particularly remarkable. He was not trying to save the world. He was not even trying to change the framework, not entirely, not on his own. He was one geologist, with a research grant and a meat grinder and a recipe from his grandfather, sitting on a bench on a planet 100 light-years from home. But the rings, he thought, and this was the real thought, the one under the other thought, the rings in that film had been created for a reason. The people who had them hadn't been the largest or the most powerful. They'd been the ones who showed up repeatedly and refused to leave, and kept holding the thing they'd been given even when the weight of it was more than they'd signed up for. The threat from the dark future had counted on them giving up. It had come backward through time, because it had already won in its own present, and it needed to win earlier and earlier to make that victory permanent. You stopped a threat like that not with a single decisive battle, but with a refusal to concede the ground being contested. You showed up. You argued from primary sources. You brought your lunch and ate it during the break and answered honest questions honestly. You published papers with colleagues who had recently revised their worldview and were not going to say so directly. You ran spectroscopic analyses on meatballs with 22-year-old doctoral students, who would go on to write dissertations that cited the morning as a methodological turning point. You were persistent and patient and a little stubborn, and you did not leave the field. Marcus sat in the courtyard until the moons rose higher, and the amber haze cooled to purple and Thresovic's fronds shifted to the configuration he'd labeled evening settling in. Then he went inside to write the last section of the sediment paper, which he'd been avoiding for 2 weeks because the conclusion required him to say something direct that he knew Vreth would find uncomfortable, and he decided it was time to stop avoiding it. The conclusion was that the polyorganic layering he'd found in the Eastern Canyon deposits was consistent with the presence of a pre-Velhari microbial civilization in the region that had predated the current geological models by approximately 800,000 years, which was not, in itself, revolutionary. But the specific chemical signature of the layering matched nothing in the Velhari biological archive, and everything in a cross-species database that Marcus had been quietly assembling for the past 6 months. A signature that appeared in the early geological records of 7 other species' homeworlds, all of them omnivores, all of them currently classified as type I or above. It was a small piece of evidence. It was one data point. It was possibly a coincidence. It was also, in Marcus's professional assessment, not a coincidence. He wrote the conclusion clearly, cited his sources, and sent it to the co-authors for review. Then he made tea, not coffee. He was rationing the coffee and went to bed. The paper on the polyorganic sediment layers was published 4 months later, with Marcus Hale as first author and Professor Vreth as second. The acknowledgments thanked Dr. Aviath's lab for supporting molecular correlation analysis, a technically accurate description of what had happened over the course of 2 sessions, in which 3 batches of meatballs had been prepared, consumed, and documented for the Nutrient Chemistry Archive. Professor Vreth's revised theoretical paper on dietary stratification and civilizational development was published 6 months after that, in the Velhari Institute's flagship journal. It retained the original core arguments, the real correlations, the good data, but incorporated 2 new sections on cooperation-based developmental pathways and a significantly expanded treatment of outlier cases. The Hrothi appeared on page 4 and were not called outliers. Marcus read it the evening before he left Duveros. His departure was the following morning. Early, the transit shuttle to the orbital hub, then the relay to the Earth Corridor station, then home. He read the paper carefully, with the attention he always gave to good work. It was good work. The argument was honest. The evidence was handled with precision. The framework had been made larger without losing its rigor. In the conclusion, Vreth wrote, "The question of what produces civilizational longevity is not reducible to dietary strategy, though dietary strategy is not irrelevant. The more useful frame may be this: which species, by whatever developmental pathway, developed the capacity to care for what was not immediately their own. The species that learned to extend concern beyond their immediate kin group, their immediate moment, their immediate hunger, those species, by a variety of mechanisms, are the ones who found their way to the stars. The mechanism matters less than the capacity. The capacity, it appears, is not species-specific." Marcus sat with that for a while. Then he packed his bag, sealed his spice kit into its hard case, wrapped the manual meat grinder in 2 layers of cloth against the transit, and went to sleep. He made meatballs one more time before he left, the morning of his departure. Small batch, just enough for himself and Celine, who came over at 6 in the morning, still half asleep, because he'd messaged her at 5:30, and she had agreed without hesitation. They ate on the small balcony of his apartment, looking out at the Duveros dawn, the light coming up slow and copper gold over the mineral plateau, the twin moons still visible, fading, the Institute quad quiet. "He'll probably never say he changed his mind," Celine said. "He published a paper saying he changed his mind. That's different from saying it. It's actually more permanent." Marcus finished his food. "He's a good scientist. Good scientists update. They just don't always announce it. You're being generous. I'm being accurate. He looked at the plateau. He's also going to cite that paper for the next 20 years, and every time he cites it, he'll have to cite the new framework. And every time he cites the new framework, it'll be because of a conversation that started with a container of lunch. I find that satisfying. Selene ate the last of her meatball with the careful attention she always brought to it. She'd had them 4 times now, and each time she approached the experience as a genuine experiment, not a performance of tolerance, which Marcus respected. It tastes better when I know what's in it, she said. I think that's true of most things. It usually is. She looked at him. Will you come back? If I get another grant. The department will invite you. Vreth will recommend it. He won't say why. Marcus smiled. He'll say the sediment analysis requires ongoing field verification. Yes, Selene said. He'll say exactly that. The sun came all the way up over the plateau, and the light turned from copper to something cleaner, white gold, clear, the kind of light that made the mineral formations glow faintly. The Institute would be starting its morning sessions in 3 hours. Somewhere in the lecture halls, a new cohort of students would hear for the first time about dietary stratification and civilizational development. Professor Vreth would be precise and elegant, and carry himself with the calm of 2,000 years of herbivorous tradition. And he would be largely correct about most of what he said. And he would be a little wrong about one important part of it. And he would know this because a human geologist had once brought meatballs to his classroom and refused to apologize for being hungry. Marcus finished his coffee. He'd brought real coffee beans from Earth and had been rationing them for 11 months, and had saved the last of them for this morning, and set the cup down. Safe travels, Selene said. Thank you for being a good scientist, Marcus said. She looked at him. I study geology. I know. Same thing. He picked up his bag and the sealed spice kit and the cloth-wrapped meat grinder, and went down the stairs to meet the transit pod, and left Duveros with the quiet certainty of someone who had done the thing they'd come to do, in the way they'd come to do it, persistent, patient, a little stubborn and well-fed. Humanity, it turned out, was not best argued for with evidence alone. Evidence helped. Good citations helped. Primary sources over secondary sources always. But what made the argument real, what made it something a 300-year-old Velhari nutrient chemist would hold in her hands and taste carefully and then sit with in honest silence, was the thing itself. 40 minutes of preparation, a recipe from a grandfather. The knowledge that you don't eat bad food to punish yourself for making it. You start again, do it better. Every time,